The book is China's Wake, a shameless plug, is available now, but I'm not going to start in China, actually, and start somewhere very different, which is Buenos Aires in 2001. And the reason that I'm putting this up is that I was actually there way back in a sort of mist of time when I was an undergrad. I did my exchange year in Buenos Aires in 2001, 2002. And as many of you probably know, that was the time when Argentina was enduring possibly the worst economic crisis of its history. Massive unemployment, strikes, riots, protests, the sort of violence that you see here. And all of this was centered around the government's attempts to maintain relationships with the IMF to keep the International Monetary Fund on side. Because of the large amount of debt that the country was in, it required IMF support. IMF support acted as a green light for support from the financial markets. And it was hard for me to understand at the time how a country where, democratically speaking, nobody would have voted for these policies, or very few people, how, it seemed at the time, the IMF was able to sort of dictate policy to a country like this. Now, that poses the question, and it's Margaret Thatcher's old statement that there is no alternative to what's sometimes called neoliberalism, a very contested word, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds about what that means, but certainly liberal economic orthodoxy informing certain policies in terms of things like privatization, deregulation, liberalisation. And I began to wonder, well, how come there was no alternative, and what conditions might an alternative present itself? And then, as the sort of first decade of the 21st century wore on, actually it did seem like there were some alternatives cropping up, particularly in Latin America. You had the so-called pink tide governments that moved away in various senses, or seemed to, from a liberal orthodox template, but also in other places as well, in slightly different directions. In Angola, for example, and Kazakhstan as well, there seemed to be a change in economic orientation towards more of a state-driven development path. So I was trying to figure out what was going on here. Now, of course, there are many countries that never seem to be prescribed into this liberal economic orthodoxy in quite the same manner, China being one, of course. But it seemed as though countries which had been through the experience of structural adjustment, had been through the experience of being highly indebted, going through multiple debt crises, and having to depend upon the IMF or donors, that it was the first time, at least in a generation, that many of these countries seemed to be breaking out of those constraints. And trying to work out what was behind all this, I started to notice that most of these countries were, in fact, natural resource exporters. They were commodity producers, but particularly in metals and in energy, so fossil fuels, but also things like copper, nickel, zinc, tin, these sorts of things. And this graph here is a commodity price index grouped into three different groups, so agricultural products, energy and metals, going back all the way to 1960. And what you see from this is that the sort of area in the red rectangle here, which is 2002 to 2013, you have in these two lines here, which are metals and energy, a boom in prices, a little bit of a dip around the global financial crisis in 2008, but then a return to those high levels before a tail off around 2014, 2015. And if you look at this, so this is inflation adjusted, over the course of 50, 60 years of history, you see that actually for those groups of commodities, these are the highest peaks in that period, right? So you often think about this, the time here, which is this purple circle, which is the two oil shocks. So in the early 70s, the late 70s with the Iranian Revolution, often remarked upon as a commodity boom. But the peak even in the late 70s, didn't approach the peak that we get to in the early 2000s, 2010s. And for metals as well, we get a peak earlier, so around the 1960s. So this is the first time in this period where you get a simultaneous boom for both of these categories of product. Oops. And the point being that this is a bigger boom, a longer boom than any of the previous ones. And no doubt that will have major political economic consequences for natural resource exporting states. Now, this is something that's often remarked upon in lots of literature, but it's never really, I think, been laid out in a systematic way what the connections are, what was going on behind all this, how did the commodity boom happen, and then how does that link to change at the national level, these alternatives that are cropping up as we talk about. So, just to go over the outline of the very basic argument here, what's happening, in fact, is China. Now, everybody knows China have this sort of miracle since the late 70s in terms of economic growth, in terms of huge scale of investment, of exports, of manufacturing industry, of infrastructure development. In short, resource-intensive development at an incredibly high pace. And I make the argument in the book that China is the principal factor behind the commodity boom in those years, roughly of 2002 to 13. And that what this does for natural resource exporters is present a new stream of revenue that's there if they want to capture it, that's basically independent of control of the international financial institutions, of capital markets, and of donors, and that this then presents the foundation for a much greater degree of policy autonomy within those years. And that really what this represents is at least a temporary change in bargaining power between resource-rich states in the south, and remember I'm talking about highly indebted ones, and the power of mobile capital. Some of these states do take advantage of this resource stream and go about maximizing it, take advantage of that difference in the balance of power in order to capture a larger proportion of what's an expanding pie already, and use it to set their own autonomous policy orientations, which I argue would not have been feasible otherwise. Not absolutely impossible, but not without suffering major negative impacts in terms of the withdrawal of mobile capital from the economy. And to link this into the sort of bigger, broader theoretical argument, what I want to argue about this is that this episode of the commodity boom is a sort of singular example, maybe the most obvious one, of the way that a rising China is basically bending and changing and shifting the circuits of global capitalism, the patterns of world accumulation. And as that changes, it will present differential opportunities and constraints to different sorts of economies. Another way you can put this is that the commodity boom is a temporary change in what people used to call the circumstances of insertion into the global economy for these resource exporting states. And one other point to make here is there's a lot written, a lot of good stuff written about China's role, China's growing role in the global south in general, but a lot of that concentrates on direct impacts, right? So investments, loans, migration, all these different questions. What I'm talking about here is an indirect effect. This isn't about if countries sell their oil directly to China necessarily. It's about China's impact on world markets for particular products, and then the space that that creates for political and economic experiments. Okay, so I'll deal with the China part of this first. We may have to rush over a little bit of this, but I think everybody's pretty on board with the idea that China's rise is a big thing now, right? We all know a lot of these statistics, but it is worth repeating a little bit because of how remarkable it is. country averaging 9.4% growth between 78 and 2012. That's not entirely unprecedented. You have earlier episodes of very rapid industrialization and growth, the East Asian tigers, for example. But what's unique about China is the combination of speed and scale. And that after particularly the dawn of the 21st century, this is an economy that is large enough to drive the sort of meta processes of global capitalism, if you like, to shape global markets. It's become a bit of a cliche to sort of mention some of these stats about how gigantic China is and the scale of what's going on there, but just a couple for you. So China's economy is big enough and growing fast enough that by the end of the period that I'm talking about, 2013, the increase in GDP in that year is like creating the entire output of Indonesia. Even with China having slowed down now to 5 or 6% growth per year, effectively every year it's like creating another Australia. So this is a huge engine of the world economy. And what makes it different from other engines of the world economy, the United States principally, is that this is still a medium income state. And that what tends to happen is a path of development, the sort of ideotypical path of an industrializing economy, is that period from low to middle income is much more resource intensive than at higher income levels. So higher income levels tends to be shift towards more services rather than manufacturing and investment. But China is a medium income state still, despite being the second largest economy in the world now. And it means that its impacts as it rises, as its gravitational pull on the world economy grows, are quite different to those of, say, the United States continuing to grow. And the key turning point in terms of the impact on the markets that I'm interested in happens around the early 2000s. So you get the entrance of China into the WTO, you get the going out or going global strategy around this time, and you get rising quantities of imports needed to satisfy this sort of ongoing expansion. A lot of people don't actually know, I think, that China is a major resource producer itself. It's still the 4th or 5th biggest producer of oil in the world. It's the 3rd largest copper producer in the world, and yet it is now by far the biggest importer of copper. And even with oil, which only makes up about 1/5 of China's energy mix, it sort of alternates with the US as being the number 1 or number 2 importer in the world. So the scale of what's going on here is what needs to be emphasized. So very quickly, just an illustration of how resource intensive China's development is. This table compares South Korea with China at years where their GDP per capita, so this is in constant dollars, was comparable, right? So where South Korea was in GDP terms per capita in 1980 is about where China was in 2007. This number is effectively a measure of the amount of energy consumed to generate $1 of GDP. So higher number, the higher, more energy intensive, therefore more resource intensive the economy was. And as you can see throughout the equivalent periods, roughly comparable. Around the end of the period that I'm talking about, so the end of the commodity boom 2015, China is beginning to get less resource intensive, but still you have this period over the commodity boom years where you have a particularly resource intensive growth path. Effectively, this is like in population terms, 25 South Koreas growing at once, so an enormous impact. And even in 2015, slightly different GDP figure here, but comparable countries in terms of GDP, none of them are similar in terms of resource intensivity. Just to give you one impression, obviously I can't tackle every single commodity here today, but to give you one example of China driving global markets, pick copper, because copper is so widely used in various industrial applications that it's often used as a predictor for how the world economy is faring in general. And the grey bars here are copper prices, world copper prices. The blue line is net copper imports from G7 countries, and the orange one is China. So as you can see, so this is up to around 2006, both G7 and China are beginning to grow, but as, in fact, markets in the global north fall off, it's still China that's growing, and China that clearly seems to be driving the price of copper. And you can do a kind of similar graph for most of these commodities. A few examples of commodities. By 2012, this is China's share of global consumption, so very high, almost half, 40 to 50% copper and nickel. Soybeans I'm putting up there because I include soy as one of the commodities affected here. Other than soy, I don't look at agricultural products. The reason that I include soy in here is for two reasons. The first is China's impact on global demand is particularly important in soy as compared to some other agricultural commodities, but it's also to do with looking at soy exporters, principally of my cases, that's Brazil and Argentina, and the structure of the soy industry there, huge monocrops controlled by small number of companies, which means that the state can effectively extract rents from that industry in a similar way to extractives that doesn't necessarily apply to other kinds of agricultural commodity. But just to mention about oil, that looks like a fairly small share, right, 12%. But then you look at this second table here, which gives you a measure of China's contribution to global consumption growth. And in fact, nearly half of oil consumption over that period, and half of new consumption comes from the growth of China. In markets like copper and nickel, above 100%, which means China's actually compensating for a drop in consumption elsewhere. So there's no doubt in my mind that China is driving this process. All right, so that's the boom. So how does it lead on to development space? How does this provide this escape hatch for these countries? Well, I've got two claims, two basic claims here. The first one is that the China-driven commodity boom allows, it permits, but it doesn't compel resource-rich states to break with liberal economic orthodoxy, as I'm talking about. But then second, whether such a break occurs, and I'll talk about what I mean by a break in a second, and the form it takes depends primarily on the nature of state-society relations in each particular case. So this isn't a simple structural kind of deterministic, kind of back to the 1970s, the global market changes and that changes domestic politics. There's lots of individual stories going on at the national level. What's happening here is a change in parameters and a loosening of constraints. And that allows countries to go in a number of different directions. What determines what direction they take usually depends upon the nature of state-society relations, and particularly the presence or absence and then the orientation of a autonomous domestic capitalist class, business class. So I want to say something first about before the boom and what I'm talking about with these policy constraints. I'm not trying to give a sort of crude idea that the IMF goes around the world and simply imposes its will where it wants. But from the structural adjustment era on, so the debt crisis of the early 1980s, right up through the 90s until the boom, basically speaking, I would argue IFIs, donors, capital markets do discipline highly indebted southern states along these directions. So again, I'm not going to get into too much of a discussion about what neoliberalism means or what I'm calling sort of liberal orthodoxy, but broadly speaking, those basic principles of privatization, liberalization, deregulation. Obviously, there's various forms of resistance, there's various forms of non-implementation, of backsliding, of movements against these policies, and that also the big caveat is that the nature of conditionality evolves over time, right? So the poverty reduction strategy papers era, for example, is quite different in some respects to the older structural adjustment, but those basic principles are there, right? If you, as a state, wanted to come up with an economic plan which was entirely contrary to those principles, it would be very difficult to get approval from international financial institutions or from donors, for example, to do that. What I want to argue is that actually among these highly indebted states that have a degree of dependency on these external financial actors, that it's very, very difficult, almost impossible to do this. There is effectively no alternative. So a couple of quick examples. Zambia in the late 1980s. Economy is going through terrible sort of recession. One of the things that the IFIs ask for is for price controls to be removed on maize, so the staple food. That causes food riots. The government, which is worried about stability, decides that it's going to try and go it alone and comes up with its own growth from own resources path. What happens? The IMF isn't happy, the World Bank isn't happy, they pull out, donors pull out as well, and eventually Zambia has to go back to the IMF. Similar in Peru in the mid-1980s, you get this in Argentina as well, that with the debt crisis of the early 80s, there are various heterodox attempts to solve those problems, which often collapse because of the withdrawal of support from the IFI. So countries have tried this and it hasn't worked. And so what I'm arguing for is that up until the boom with these highly indebted resource exporting states, there's a continuing parameterization of what is acceptable policy. And it's only the commodity boom that allows states to break out of this. So very briefly, I haven't got time to get into the sort of empirical case here too much, but if you look at terms of trade indices for these resource exporters, some of my cases here, this group here, they all follow this pattern to slightly different shape of graphs, but of a major increase, a major positive shock in the terms of trade over the 2000s with that slight dip around the financial crisis, and then falling off to various degrees after the end of the boom. These three flatter lines here, so this one is manufacturers, so terms of trade are actually getting worse. This is major food exporting countries, and then you have the G7 countries as well. So relative to other types of economy, these states are receiving a major sort of positive external shock, driven by the boom, driven by China. So the argument is, well, that allows them to capture a greater share of resource rents, and allows the space for a break with liberal orthodoxy. Now, what am I talking about with a break? A change in overall policy set or orientation. I'm not talking about individual policies here. I'm talking about a direction of travel, not necessarily about fixed or endpoint. So all these states that I look at in the various parts of the book are at different levels of liberalisation, if you like, at the beginning of the boom. But what matters is whether that changes direction, not where they end up, if you like. So broadly, a shift away from privatisation, deregulation, liberalisation, and increasing role of the state in the economy in a number of different ways. I would say that what I'm talking about here is more than resource nationalism. You have a lot of resource exporting states that up the royalty rates on their resource exports, or the taxation rates, or perhaps start to get the state more involved in extraction. That's perhaps often the first step to what I'm talking about, but what I'm talking about as being a break is more than that, is using that extra resource revenue and employing it in a way that allows the economy to, and policy to move in a different direction. Now, the various states that I look at are, not all of them have some sort of master plan, coherent agenda here, but for something to be called a break in my terms, I'm talking about more than a couple of ad hoc policies. There's some countries where that does happen. It doesn't add up to a substantive change of orientation. And I should note as well that this isn't necessarily celebratory, right? Not all of these states that have changed direction have necessarily done well from it. You know, there have been mistakes, there have been failures along the way. And just a quick note about this, that I'm not going to get into this empirical part of it too much, but that essentially what I do is use comparative qualitative analysis with 18 cases, both resource exporters and non-resource exporters. You've got the scoping conditions there, and I find that resource dependency, so being a resource exporter, is necessary but not sufficient for a break, right? So if you don't have a large export sector in natural resources, these countries don't move in a different direction. It's the presence of that extra revenue from resources which allows countries to move. Okay, and then the second half of the book is about taking each of these 15 different natural resource exporting states, looking at their experience in a more fine-grained way, and then thinking about whether we can categorize them. So I've said breaks happen, countries go in several different directions, but is there a sort of pattern to that? And I think there is. So as I've already said, there's no kind of mechanical correspondence between global shift and national level consequences. The boom effectively is a kind of escape hatch from this disciplinary power of IFIs and global finance, which presents the possibility for many different directions to be taken after going through it. There are 5 types of response to the boom conditions that I identified among my 15 cases of resource exporting states, and each of those 5 types corresponds to a different pattern of state-society relationships and a different political economic orientation as well. 3 of these 5 types I think you can call breaks. 2 of them are different kinds of liberal continuity, of continuing neoliberalization, if you like. And that's what I kind of come up with. I haven't got time, obviously, to go into every case in a great deal of detail. But as I say, there's 2 types here of continuity, of continued liberalization, and 3 different kinds of breaks. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about the 3 kinds of break. I will mention the others a bit, obviously, if you want to ask questions. So to go into this in more detail, what determines whether a break happens and the direction it takes if it does? Boom conditions, because you have this possibility of capturing more of the resource surplus, you have effectively a different set of bargaining conditions with mobile capital, changes the domestic landscape of politics, of the political economy, and presents opportunities for various groups, perhaps different groups, to control and direct state power, because you have a sort of dimming of the power of mobile capital, which often acts in concert with local actors, local business that is oriented in a certain way to be allied with those groups. So by lessening the power of mobile capital, of external capital, it's often kind of taking the legs out from under domestic, transnationally oriented capital as well. So what kinds of groups are we talking about? What makes the difference? Well, the first thing is there a autonomous domestic capitalist class group of business which has, as the source of its accumulation, if you like, outside the state? If so, then what I think determines what direction the state goes in is this business class, how strong is it, how relatively unified is it, particularly compared to popular class movements and groups, and then also the orientation of the leading elements. So this isn't quite, again, a kind of back to the 70s internal and comprador bourgeoisie or anything like that, but it's about orientation and ties with mobile capital, with transnational capital. Very often, some of these cases have the larger countries that still had a larger industrial base. There's still a core of quite concentrated, powerful domestic manufacturing industrial capital groups, which often counterpose to finance, for example. If there isn't a relatively autonomous capitalist class, all these countries have business people, they all have accumulation going on at some level, but if that's not necessarily very autonomous from the state, or it's relatively insignificant compared to the the size of the revenue flowing through the state, the state managers themselves are the primary determinant of what direction the country goes in. And what I find to be important here is whether the state has a legacy of aid dependence or not. Does the country sort of have 20 or 30 years of a major presence of donors and, say, something like 10% or more GDP coming from ODA? So I'll talk about the individual types so you get a bit of a sense. So the first one, this is one of the breaks, what I call the Neodevelopmentalist type. These are ideal types. Obviously, none of the cases fit exactly, but there's this idea of sort of family resemblance here of Argentina and Brazil. So these are the two cases that I looked at with the larger domestic industrial base, of course, that suffered during the 1980s and 1990s, but actually often became more concentrated, more sort of unified during that time. And for example, if you take Argentina, you have that economic crisis in the late 90s, early 2000s, followed by actually default and a break with the IMF. And to sort of rebuild, there was a turn towards, with the country cut off from global financial markets, to rebooting domestic production and to favouring the domestic industrial class, essentially. So the ascendancy here of domestic productive capital, but that's not just producing for the domestic market. One of the ideas around neodevelopmentalism is about national champions, right, that can compete at home, can compete abroad as well, but the idea of using the state in order to support those firms and to sort of learn the lessons of the East Asian experience. In terms of the political coalition, so this fraction of capital, if you like, is the ascendant one, but there's also a compromise with sort of popular class groups. So particularly in the Argentinian case, you have the Piquetero movement, the movement of the unemployed, which is very important, which is sort of channeled and bureaucratized through various sort of social programs that give aid to these groups. And you do have a sharing of some of the gains from the commodity boom, some redistributive schemes, higher wages in Brazil and Argentina, things like Bolsa Familia, of course. But this is a sort of attempt to channel resources to local industrial capital primarily. Although whether this works or not is, well, very dubious, in fact. In fact, what seems to happen is that commodity rents are siphoned off in order to support local industrial production, which in fact is suffering from global competition, and it's being kept on almost life support. So briefly talk about Argentina. So in the 1990s, we've already been there. Problems stem mainly from an overvalued currency, the peso, which is pegged to the dollar to solve inflation problems. But because you've got an overvalued currency, that hobbles competitiveness, and you get growth, but debt-led growth, right? So growth of consumption fueled by credit boom and imports and the sort of out-competing of the local manufacturing sector. 2002, the final sort of devaluation. Eduardo Dualde is caretaker president and sets up a bunch of ad hoc schemes to sort of help in an emergency. But many of these, and this is what I'm talking about, this not being a mechanical process, there are a number of contingencies in every single one of the stories of the cases here. But those ad hoc measures become the basis for social programs in Kirchnerismo, in the presidencies of the two Kirchners which follow, and which really do set the break going from former neoliberal policy. So not really talked about as much as Brazil, actually, but there is a kind of industrial policy under the Kirchners, 5 times the level of infrastructure spending as before, the use of export taxes from soy to fund producer and consumer subsidies, price controls, use of directed credit, lots of things going on that don't look like neoliberalism. And crucially, and here's, I guess, the test, this could not have been agreed with the IMF in the 1990s, no way. and the revival of the old Peronist coalition in a sense, right? So the rise of new grupos económicos, grupos K, as in Kirchner, very much associated with the rise of Kirchner, and urban labour as well, particularly the Truckers' Union, for example, as part of this sort of political coalition which effectively is charge of the state for that time. So I think I will, so I'll talk about one of the other types of break. Probably many of you are familiar with this one, which is often seen as the more radical Latin American tendency. So here I'm talking about Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela. Call this type extractivist redistributive. So in these cases, and this is the ideal, typical formation if you like, you do have a capitalist class and it is autonomous from the state, but it's relatively weak and divided. So often this is, in the Andean countries, a sort of schism between lowland and highland capital. It isn't necessarily about exporters versus a kind of domestic industrial base or anything like that. But you have this division, and often at the point where the commodity boom begins to happen, these factions have effectively sort of fought each other to a standstill, and that presents an opportunity for, broadly speaking, coalitions of popular class groups. Very often, for instance, in Bolivia, social movements make up the backbone of the MAS, Evo Morales' party, that gain control of the state. And what these countries are perhaps most known for is populism of one sort or another. So this sort of political style, majoritarianism, constant popular mobilization, frequent use of referenda, new constitutional arrangements, not treating the state as neutral territory, if you like, a willingness to change constitutional arrangements, but in the political economic sense, definitely more of a role for the state, nationalizations, expropriations even in some cases, but what you get are quite limited efforts to diversify, to actually have a sort of developmentalist take on things. There are some limited efforts, but not too much. The main focus is on redistribution and social spending of various kinds. And actually, to varying degrees, at least in the early years, all these three are relatively successful with that. So I take Ecuador as a kind of example case here. Again, you have this kind of highland, lowland, or in this case, coastal split between economic elites, between Guayaquil and Quito mainly. You have an economic crisis in 1999, and in the early 2000s you have a kind of false start, if you like, under this guy Lucio Gutierrez, who's a former colonel, who kind of stood on a platform that was somewhat similar to Correa that would come later, but then actually didn't put through half of the reforms that he kind of claimed he would. Then you get a caretaker president, followed by Correa in 2006. His coalition of support is a little bit different to that seen in Venezuela and Bolivia, a quite important urban middle class here. But you see these similar features in many senses. There's maybe more of a developmentalist ambition in Ecuador than the other two. But really the stress on redistribution, so the Human Development Bond or the Human Development Bonus, depending on how you translate it, which is a monthly stipend to 40%, the poorest 40% in the country. So it's a big deal. But quite ambitious in terms of trying to change power relations. So targeting the finance sector, which is very unpopular after the 99 crisis, making it so that financial institutions cannot own companies or any other company. Media as well, there's a degree of authoritarianism to this as well, crackdown on the media, but things like capital controls, things like a crackdown on tax avoidance, and public investment-led growth, things like building of infrastructure, that sort of thing. Very quickly then, to finish off, so I'll just do one last one, which is the third break, if you like, which I call the oligarchic extractivist type, and here we've got two cases, Angola and Kazakhstan. So this is one of the two types where the capitalist class in these countries is relatively small and highly dependent upon the state. So from the state in terms of contracts, of licenses, of et cetera, the revenue flowing through the coffers of the state outweighs any sort of independent sources of domestic accumulation, which means you get a differentiation. The differentiation between public and private economic and political power is blurred, and that state managers themselves hold the main levers of economic and political power. Now, in these two cases, what marks them out, and in fact what I think leads to the break or is very important in it, is that these are cases that have no history or very little history of aid dependency. And this is what marks them out from, there's another type which I call donor-dependent orthodoxy. Let me go back. Yeah, so donor-dependent orthodoxy there, and I think the difference between this kind of case and this kind of case is that in here you have that legacy of aid dependence. So donors have been involved in the management of the state, and they've also been relied upon as a revenue source, which I think seems to make the people in charge of those states less inclined to risk relationships with those donors. Whereas somewhere like Angola, for example, emerges out of the civil war in 2002 and is not exactly a blank slate, but it hasn't really been through structural adjustment. So it doesn't have that history of donor involvement, and it sets its own sort of independent course. So let me get back to this. So this oligarchic extractivist type, I think, is kind of similar to the old rentier state model. So you have a high modernist vision of development that's state-led, that you get a certain degree of sort of elite accumulation, but lots of sort of waste and predation as well mixed in. That there's a lot of infrastructure development, urban development. You look at landscapes in Astana or Nur Sultan, as it's just been renamed, and Luanda as well. And the comparison here is maybe with sort of early stages of Gulf capitalism, if you like. Adam Hanier's book on Gulf capitalism is very helpful in this sense of seeing a sort of pattern that seems to be emerging in these countries, or at least was. So as I've said, Angola emerged as civil war, 2002. It never really fully experienced structural adjustment. There's negotiations with donor. Obviously this is a wrecked country after the war. But booming oil receipts and access to loans, and especially Chinese loans actually, means that the government avoids having to implement any kind of IFI program. IMF negotiations, so the IMF wants very tough conditions just after the Civil War, but after the boom, and this illustrates the difference in bargaining power, by the time that a program is agreed with the IMF in 2009, I think it is, that actually the IMF is a lot softer, so they're not half as bothered about enormous holes in the coffers of the state. Major reconstruction infrastructure drive, so infrastructure spending equivalent to 14% of GDP per year, and control of oil rents is used to try and sort of nurture the development of a limited middle class that will be dependent on the state in one way or another. All right, so very quickly, last thing, so obviously the boom ended in 2014, so what's happened since? Of course, after 2013 or so, when prices start to decline, it's much harder to maintain political economic settlements with lower resource prices, and we are getting a variety of outcomes. So Venezuela has been a complete catastrophe, obviously. These governments have been overthrown in some places effectively, so Bolivia just now, and that happened after I wrote the book. Brazil also. Electoral defeat in Argentina. Argentina may be a bit of a test case because we've had the re-election of basically a full-throated neoliberal in Macri, and now the defeat of Macri in the latest election, and the election of a sort of centre-left, soft-left government that we'll see what happens with that. Or then, in some other cases, a kind of rollback without any necessarily massive change no coup or electoral defeat in places like Ecuador and Angola. The one place remaining where there is perhaps a degree of continuity is Kazakhstan, which actually is still having a major stimulus program, is still state-led development, has had some political troubles in recent months, but it seems to be the only holdout still. And these countries, as the bottom has fallen out of resource markets, have often sought to cover, as often happens in busts, have covered their expenses by borrowing more money. The difference with the 1970s, when a similar pattern happened, is that in a lot of cases some of these debts now are to China, which will have its own implications. So, talking about legacies, it may be easy to look at that last slide and say, well, what was the point of all that then, if most of it's gone back to what it was? Well, it's a decidedly mixed legacy, I think, but there are some important things that stay with it. None of these models can really be sustained without high resource prices. Neodevelopmentalism is not a theory that's been developed in order to take advantage of the commodity boom. It's meant to apply in any economic time. But actually, I think that the experience of Brazil and Argentina over those years has shown that it didn't really work. But what I would say is that we have this period here of a decade or slightly longer, and that is comparable in importance, I think, to the earlier episode in the 1970s of the new international economic order, where you had similarly a range of southern states trying new approaches, proposing new power relations within the global political economy. And that didn't work either in the end, but it's still an important example. There's no simple return to business as usual here, but it's not clear how it mixes with other global dynamics, so things like the US-China trade war, what is happening in the US anyway, that, is Trump a sign of some sort of realignment? What happens if we get a Sanders or maybe Warren presidency? But anyway, in some cases what we can say is that the return of austerity and conditionality to many of these cases has been harder to implement. You've seen the protests in Ecuador, for example, that have forced some concessions. This stuff would have been kind of accepted in the 1990s. Social policies often have stayed. There's a legacy of that, often quite popular and hard to get rid of. Bolsonaro in Brazil, trying to get rid of Bolsa Familia, but this is quite hard to do. And a lot of these states have made, if you look at what the condition was in 2002 versus now, have made considerable progress on the standard range of socioeconomic and development indicators. So there's some rollback, there's some retrenchment, but there are some things that are here to stay too. So very briefly, we've got 2 minutes or so. So talking about where we go from here. So as I say, I think the reason to write about the commodity boom in this way is not just because it's incredibly significant for each of these countries, but that it's an example of how a large economy like China, as it rises, can change global structures in a way that produces opportunities, produces constraints for different world regions, different types of economy, different sorts of states. And I think we're likely to see examples like this in the future as well. It's hard to see exactly what these are going to be at the moment, but we can make a few guesses. So you look at the Belt and Road, for example, massive infrastructural investments and loans across the world from China. What are the political economic effects of being part of that program? Development finance, which is what I'm personally starting to work on more now. You have this growth of a parallel system almost of financing of development loans from Chinese policy banks that adhere to a different modality than the IMF and the World Bank and et cetera, and it's not clear how those different systems are going to mesh. So this could be a major source of some sort of shift. Another thing is the Chinese economy, this much talked about rebalancing towards more domestic consumption-driven growth. Mixed evidence as to whether that's happening, but if it does, that changes the profile of demand for commodities. So it may be that, for example, as incomes rise in China, you see a lot more meat being added to diet. So maybe the next boom would be in say, animal products, for example, things like this. And then what's going to happen to the Chinese economy longer term as well? We are seeing a slowdown. How much will that be sustained? Huge buildup of debt in China. Are we going to see a crash? Are we going to see something like the Japanese experience in the 1990s, where you've got to slow down, slow glide into a kind of stagnation? I've talked about US realignment. This big question about, is neoliberalism, whatever you think neoliberalism means, is it dead? Is it mutating in some way, as Quinn Slobodian says? But the other lesson is late development is really, really hard. We have very few examples of real successes of this. And that what I want to say is that these parameters that I'm talking about, this circumstance of insertion into the global economy, shapes the limits of the possible. Now, these are not just hard deterministic limits, but they do make certain alternatives a lot harder or easier. And maybe you only have small windows to take advantage of things like the boom. So we need to be attentive to what trends might be coming and develop plans that countries can successfully take advantage of these windows when they come. And the other thing which I haven't mentioned at all yet, and I'm sure a few of you are wondering about, is climate change, which is hanging over all this stuff, right? It's a very difficult decision for a lot of countries in the global south to make. If you are a poor country that is an oil exporter, what do? Most of that oil has to stay in the ground if we have any chance of staying below, say, a 2-degree change in temperature, which itself is going to cause all kinds of problems. So what is the path for these countries? And I think that's very difficult to work out right now. And that's it from me, I think. So thank you very much.
Fascinating, excellent talk, wide-ranging. I'm sure there are many questions. We'll take a few. Please say your name, introduce yourself, and then go ahead. Yeah.